Welcome back to this episode of the MindSpa Podcast. Today we are talking about military and mental health and why it can be really hard to get support. So you're going to be our expert today because you have been, maybe give us a little bit of background on how long you've been working with military.
Sure. So I started working with military families in 2009. And my initial role was at the Family Resource Center, and I was a family liaison officer. So I worked primarily with the spouses and the children of military members. And so when members were being deployed, or if there were relational issues or children needing support, I would provide support to the children, to the spouses, but never my mandate or the mandate of the center was not for the members. It was for the family members. And so I spent time working with family members for about a year, and then I transitioned to working with still the spouses, but of those who are ill or injured. And so everyone who I would see in my second role had a spouse who had either a physical injury or a mental health injury. And so I continued working with spouses for, I would say, the first 2 or 3 years of my career. After working with military family members, I eventually moved to working with the members themselves. And so that's when I moved into working in Petawawa with members who were in active service. So providing treatment to individuals who either had a diagnosis of PTSD, anxiety, depression. I did a lot of the addictions work, so I was one of the base addiction counselors. And so the term that they've coined in the military is an OSI, so an operational stress injury. Any injury that's occurred as a result of operations falls under the OSI umbrella.
The addiction would be...
that could be considered an OSI as well. So I worked in their program primarily with those who have OSIs for a couple of years. Transitioned from there to now working with veterans. So at the OSI clinic here in Ottawa, I spent about 10 years there working with veterans. So these are individuals who've been released from service and no longer actively serving, providing support to them in that capacity, as well as to RCMP members. And so I kind of feel like I've had the full experience, the children and the spouses, ill and injured children and spouses, the active members, and then the veteran side of the house as well too. And so that's what I'd say. So that's been the last 18 years of my career, has been working in different elements and realms of the military culture and the veteran space as well.
How important is it, do you think, to understand the culture, the military culture, when you're working with people who are serving or have served?
I think without that, it's hard to put things into context. I think when you understand a culture, whether it's a racial culture, whether it's any kind of culture, understanding culture and having competency in that culture helps to put things into context for an individual. Exactly. Yeah. Right. There's less educating that has to happen on the client's part, but they can really just come in and get the support that they're needing. I say that, but then I also recognize that treatment is treatment, right? And so at the end of the day, we want to ensure that they're getting supports in places where they can access supports. I think depression is depression, whether or not you're a military or you're a civilian or Black or you're white, and depression is what it is. And so culture is important. However, the most important piece is being able to understand the treatment aspect of whatever the individual is presenting with. But I would say that it is important. And if you can be competent in that culture, military culture especially, I think that it does help in terms of the treatment aspect of things.
When it comes to culture, what do you notice based on military culture and that messaging around mental health, the messaging around having a problem, either from a mental health or physical health standpoint, and what that looks like in asking for help?
I think there's a duality at play, because when you think about the military culture, there's this need for high readiness. You need to be deployable. You need to go on certain training. A lot of times when you think about an injury, whether it's a mental health injury, that can sometimes impact readiness. And so the culture doesn't really make room for as much awareness towards mental health, right? I mean, we're coming a long way. That's not to say that things haven't shifted.
So you've seen a lot change
There's been a
over
shift.
18 years?
I feel like there's been a shift. It's been more openness. Whereas before, I've heard them say, like, if you had PTSD, even ADHD, that was a career ender.
Really?
Yeah. And so there's been...
That'd be really good in the military, is actually having ADHD. So that's surprising. But I hear
because
you.
of the medication, because
familiar.
controlled substance, so you're not really deployable to some countries. That's still very much the case.
That's still a problem.
For some folks, that's still a challenge. That promotes a stigma, right? I'm not going to get the help. I'm not going to get the support. But I think what they're also realizing is maybe I should actually go and get the support so that I can have tools that can prepare me, that can help me manage my symptoms and be considered operational despite how I'm feeling or despite my diagnosis. I think there's been a shift over time and more awareness where we're recognizing like you could still function well in your role even if you have PTSD
Especially
in your role. Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're in treatment, if you're engaged in treatment, you can still be very high functioning and succeed in your role despite a diagnosis of PTSD or depression.
I can see that needing to be a very important shift where the leadership and those who are deciding who goes where, who does what role, who gets promoted, all of that doesn't look at that diagnosis and say, okay, I'm discounting that person. If they look at it and go, oh, they're in treatment for that. Great.
Or we can actually be very supportive and selective with what kind of role they do.
Right.
Exactly. And so if, for example, I'm just, I don't know, like a military police officer, I might not do many of the frontline general duties piece, but I might be more administrative in nature, or I might kind of shift what I do so that my exposure to work is limited and doesn't continue to impact my treatment or my recovery so that I can still do my job and still feel like I'm making progress in my treatment versus kind of it being re-triggered continuously as I'm trying to get better. There's a lot more accommodations, a lot more flexibility, which I think is hugely important for folks. To not feel as if how they're feeling or how they're coping becomes a career ender, but we're able to adapt in ways that we haven't historically. So I think that's a huge step towards the right direction.
One of the things that I heard a veteran say recently, in the military, the culture is very much do what we say. We tell you what to do, where to go, where to eat. It's very much you have to follow orders. And I could see that being a positive thing if some of the orders are you need to get support or you need to get help. But if they're not telling them to do that, do you think that that could be a barrier if I'm not being told to get help, which then actually stops me from feeling comfortable or even thinking about asking for help?
Yeah, that could be a barrier in a lot of ways. And sometimes they are told to get help. So they have this piece in the military called counseling and probation. Right? So if they're on CNP, then they're told like you need to be in counseling.
Okay.
Exactly.
It's probably
you don't want it to get to a point where so I think what you're talking about is it being encouraged preventatively versus being encouraged punitively. I think there's room for that to be made where we're encouraging it. And it really depends on who is in your chain of command and how they feel about mental health, how they manage their own mental health, and if they're able to give you that same level of compassion, or if they also have an unhelpful view of mental health, and that shows up in their leadership style as well.
Right.
So there's definitely room for it to be more encouraged and mandated. But I think the beautiful thing is when you're still serving, going to your appointments is considered part of your duty, right? Having that done during work hours is important because this is part of your obligation. You're expected to, going to your appointment is part of you going to work.
That takes barriers down.
So I think that's part of it where I'm not forcing you to go, but I'm making room for you to go, right? Go to your 2-hour appointment or your group appointment or individual appointment during your work hours because that's accounted for. Don't feel like you have to find time out of your work schedule, taking away from family time to treat your mental health. We want to support you as much as we possibly can. So we're seeing strides in supporting CAF members, veterans, and their families, their mental health. We're seeing the benefits all around.
It's interesting. One of the takeaways at training when we did the prolonged exposure training, and one of my takeaways was how avoidance can be the key difference between experiencing trauma and developing PTSD or experiencing trauma and potentially not developing PTSD. And it made me realize from a cultural standpoint within the military, if the culture was focused on not avoiding, it could really make a big difference. But historically, it was like, oh, you went through a traumatic event, move through it, keep going. You didn't die.
Exactly.
Let's be grateful. Now let's move on. And I do hope that that's something that over time can evolve because if the expectation, I think we just changed it. You went through a traumatic event. The expectation is it's traumatic. You're going to be affected by that traumatic event. Let's get intervention nice and early. And we stop the avoidance before it takes root.
Exactly.
Because that really prolonged and expansive avoidance. I avoid, let's say the smell of smoke bothers me. So I start avoiding campfires and it can get all the way to the point that I can't even handle walking past somebody who's smoking a cigarette.
Yeah, I think the avoidance is almost like their way of coping with what they know. If I was to be transparent and honest with how I'm feeling, then that could be a career ender.
Right.
And so I need to just soldier on. I need to keep it moving somehow, some way. But I think if we are able to dismantle some of the stigmas, then I'm less inclined to shove down my experiences. I think there's so many things that from a systems level can help impact the amount of avoidance. But again, we also know that avoidance is one of the criteria for PTSD. And so sometimes we don't recognize that I'm avoiding because of the pain of my experience or because of the pain of my trauma experience. And so there's room there for the avoidance to be a telltale sign of like, hey, something is off, right? Because I find that I'm avoiding.
Even I try not to think about it.
Exactly. So whether it's like a cognitive avoidance or like a physical avoidance, right? Like, so whether it's like smoke or diesel for many people or barbecue smells for a lot of other folks, those are often very common avoidances, but it could just be like the thought or the memory, right? Those are some things that we often find are high levels of avoidance. Noticed with the clients that I've worked with in the past is there has been a need for avoidance in some capacity.
Right. It's also our gut instinct. Anything that makes us stressed.
Yeah, we want to just kind of put it down.
Our human instinct is to avoid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so especially if you're in theater or in a combat environment and, 2 hours ago, something catastrophic just happened, you're still trying to wrap your mind around it, but you're also having to go on another patrol, in 15 minutes.
Right.
There's room and a need in those moments to avoid, right? Because the emotions will get in the way of you being able to function. Exactly. And so avoidance has had its place, which is sometimes I find it helpful to really educate folks on understanding, like, you've had to avoid to be able to function well in your role. That's what made you an amazing soldier, right? That's what made you so good at your job, is that you knew how to avoid. You knew how to compartmentalize, how to put things aside and get the job done. However, that served its purpose. And right now it's not serving a purpose. It's getting in the way of your recovery. And so having them understand the role that avoidance played then and the role that's playing now, I think is extremely helpful and important for individuals, and realizing that it just keeps us stuck.
Yeah.
Especially when it's not needed as much as it perhaps once was.
That's interesting that you say that, though, because it makes me think of just more globally. We see that a lot in the therapy room, that some strategy that worked for you for a purpose and you needed it for your survival.
Yeah.
The need for survival goes away, but the strategy sticks around and it starts going from helpful to harmful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so now it's more of like, this is a maladaptive coping strategy, whereas before I needed that. Without the avoidance, without being able to dissociate in certain high stressful moments, I could have been at risk or put others at risk. Whereas right now it's harmful to me, to my family, and to everyone else around me. Yeah.
And it can be hard to see because for a lot of military folk, they don't know how to recognize they're struggling. They almost normalize some of the stuff that they all experience. Oh, that's just the human experience versus I can get help for this. This is something that could actually improve with support. They just don't even see that there's an issue. That can happen with pain. You just get used to dealing with certain type of pain. I don't even go to physio, or I don't talk to my doctor about it because I'm just like, everybody's got the aches and pains. You're like, no, you have a broken something. You know what I mean? Like, you actually have a severe injury that needs some attention, but it's just like you get used to it.
We redefine what our norms are, what our thresholds are over time, whether it's physically or mentally. You just get so used to it, right? So many folks are like, I don't go to Costco anymore. That's my new norm. And so we develop all these I can't rules. I can't go to Costco anymore. I can't go to concerts. I can't sit with my back to the door. I can't be in loud places. And all of these things become our new norm. And we can see that it's been an impact of trauma experiences when we look back and say, well, when did these start to develop? When did they start to become my new norm? Did it happen after a significant experience that I've had that I now develop these new behaviors? And so I think it's realizing that it's progressive. We don't often just shift overnight.
Especially avoidance is so progressive.
And you don't notice it until you notice it.
I always think of the comfort zone. The comfort zone does never stays the same. It is either expanding or contracting. And so based on your behavior, your comfort zone will either be expanding or contracting. And we always have to be trying to expand it or it will contract. Life gets very small.
And that's why I say to my folks, I'm like, PTSD shrinks your world.
Yeah.
it really shrinks your world. So back to the contracting, it shrinks your world, right? And your realms of safety start to decrease, and where I can feel a sense of control starts to decrease, and who I trust starts to decrease. And like all of these circles start to get smaller and smaller. Whereas before it was almost like this bullseye where there was lots of circles to it. And I had different people in different areas. Whereas now I'm just like in that little center space. And the list of people that I can socialize with or that I trust starts to decrease. And so we see that a lot with our soldiers, right? Based on experience, that starts to decrease over time. And the sense of safety and trust and power and control and even our self-esteem and intimacy, all those different aspects really shift after trauma. And so it's hard to notice that things are even happening because of how progressive it is, right? And especially if you're in a situation where many others are experiencing very similar things to you, kind of just feel like, well, this is what we do.
Yeah. This is just
Right?
normal. Everybody's saying the same thing for there's no problem here. Well, did you notice that often it'd be family members that noticed first that there was a problem?
Yeah.
And would you often see a struggle if that family member would try to bring the problem to the military personnel, that they would struggle to hear it from their partner, being like, no, don't be telling me what's wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with me.
I definitely saw that a lot, especially in my earlier work with spouses, where they would come in and that would be the premise of their sessions, is talking about the impact that what they're seeing in their partners having on them. And he's not wanting to get help or he doesn't see it. And so that's where having that support of like, how do we communicate this to their partner? Do we want to bring them in and have a session where we can talk about what you're experiencing it? So it doesn't feel as if it's being an attack, but more so like, this is how I'm feeling since you've gotten back from your deployment. But I think definitely others can see things better than we can.
Yeah, always.
As relates to us. And I think it rings more true when it comes to the military folks, right? Because they're around themselves, they're in their culture. And so this is our norm. But when I step outside of that and I'm with extended family or with my spouse, and things are highlighted a lot differently, and they're able to point things out that I would not have seen either on my own or within my group of fellow servicemen or women. Yeah. And so I think definitely the spouses play a huge role in pointing things out. Sometimes they notice it a lot as bed partners, right? That, okay, apparently my wife said that I was like giving orders in my sleep or acting out in my sleep. And so those are often some telltale signs, because in the daytime, it's easy to suppress. It's easy to ignore those experiences, distract yourself. They don't see it. Others don't see it. But when they come in and mention, like my wife mentioned that I was doing this in my sleep and apparently I was doing this, I stood up and did this, and it kind of brings things home a bit more for them.
Now, did you ever see, because I was wondering if there was ever a stigma where the family would think, I really want to get support. I really want my partner to get support. But because I know how the system works, I feel afraid to actually voice my concerns because I'm afraid of the impact that it might have.
With the members? Like, have they?
With their family members. Because we have already said that the members themselves can struggle. But I wonder if ever the family members are like, I shouldn't ask for help because it's going to look bad on him or her.
Right.
Did you ever see that? Or not really?
I can't say that I've seen that, but I'm sure it exists.
Yeah.
I think they felt safe coming forth with support that I was providing at the resource center because it was so separate from the members' work. We weren't allowed to communicate with the members' work.
That was smart.
I think that was a huge systems piece that removed any barriers or access to care. Where it's two separate entities, you can't even communicate with the member's doctor if the spouse says something. It was very separate in the sense. So I think that was one of the things that make access to care for the spouses a lot more accessible without it feeling as if like, okay, if I say this to my social worker or therapist, then my partner's job is at risk. That isn't a reality, I think, when it comes to the support they're getting, at least from the resource centers when I worked there, at least.
You were talking about sleep, and it made me think about sleep because I personally had insomnia for a few years after having lots of kids and that type of stuff. But I didn't realize I had insomnia because I had defined it as never sleeping. And I was like, I sleep, I fall asleep. I lose time, the clock changes. But I didn't actually know that I had insomnia. And so I'm curious what you see with sleep issues, and that I don't realize I have a sleep issue because it feels so normal that, I takes me an hour to fall asleep. That's normal, right? Or I wake up 10 times in the night or that type of stuff. So do you often see sleep disruption with military folk?
Very common amongst the military folks that I work with. I would say sometimes that's sort of the first symptom that they're identifying is
I
like,
feel like it's one of the safest ones too,
I think so.
from a mental health perspective.
Exactly.
Like, this feels safe.
Exactly. So I feel like that's always the entry point for folks in treatment, right? It's like, I'm seeing a social worker for sleep. Okay. But as we get into it, we recognize that there's a lot more happening than just I'm not able to fall asleep, because sleep is very, very closely linked to stress and anxiety. And so what are the things that we're stressing about? What are the things that we're anxious about? What are the things that we're constantly repeating as we're trying to fall asleep? That often gets us to float back to an incident or a moment or a trauma of some kind, right? For many of the folks that I work with. And so sleep often becomes the first point of contact, but it guides us into other areas that require our attention as well. But definitely something that comes up a lot in individuals. And it's a great starting point because sure, it feels safe, it's comfortable, we can all try to get some sleep. But at some point, we want to address the root cause of our insomnia, contributing towards that. And when we notice that we weren't first falling asleep and where that takes us to. Yeah. It's definitely a very common part of the experience that I see with the members that I work with and the veterans that I work with. And then nightmares, obviously, to go with that sometimes for folks.
So that's pretty common. I can imagine too, self-medicating for sleep. I know a lot of people in the civilian population, they believe alcohol helps them sleep. You and I both know, sure, maybe falling asleep, which might look more like passing out.
Exactly.
But the quality of the sleep that you get is absolutely horrific. Yeah. And so I could imagine that being something that could mask some of the sleep issues.
Yeah. And so even if the use of marijuana for many as well, just trying to get to sleep, and even prescribed, like being more open to prescribed, which is fun. I always notice that they're more open to like prescribed, I should say all, but they're often open to prescribed sleep medication than anxiety medication or depression medication.
Right. Again, less stigma to the sleep piece.
Is it the anxiety, though, that's contributing to the insomnia? Let's treat that and let's see how you're able to fall asleep. Maybe you'll get deeper sleep than you're getting with just taking
because sleep meds, they will make you sleep, but there's some downside.
Exactly. Again, you're not getting that deep restorative sleep that you're needing. And so back to the stigma piece, right? Certain things are more open and acceptable to talk about, and others are perhaps less. But it's one of those things that I think comes up very often. And the beautiful thing is that it's very treatable, but I definitely see that a lot. And again, leading that to a PTSD diagnosis sometimes, or a depression diagnosis or anxiety diagnosis, but it's a guiding point to other things often.
And so when it comes to generally working with the military, is there anything to anybody who's listening right now that might be wondering if they're struggling? Is there anything that, or is it a list of sort of, if you're experiencing this, if you're experiencing that, this is something that is treatable?
Yeah. I think the first thing is if you notice that there's been a shift between the things that you once enjoyed doing and what you're doing right now. And so lifestyle habits or your social life, and that's shifted over time. Right? If you notice that you're not hanging out with as many as your friends as you perhaps used to hang out with, again, and your world has shrunk in so many different ways, the things that you used to enjoy doing, you find that they bring on a level of anxiety for you. I think those are important telltale signs of there's certain red flags that I want to address. I think when we think about mental health, especially within the military context, there's high levels of resilience. And so we get so used to white knuckling or powering through or pushing through. And so what might be a high level of distress to me, it takes me to like an 80. For someone listening, they might be like, oh, I'm at a 50. I'm okay. Right? Because your resilience levels are different. What you've been exposed to, it's all relative. And so I think it's important to recognize, what is my level of distress? Right? Is this now a 50, but before this felt like a 70 or like a 20 to me? Like, has there been a shift either direction of how I'm viewing things I'm experiencing? What are others saying, right? Do I have friends who are like, hey, I haven't heard from you in a long time. Why don't we meet anymore? Or even your spouse, have they noticed that things have shifted? I think sometimes relying on the objective views of other people could be helpful, or even just looking at your behavioral patterns and have those shifted. Those are really good telltale signs. But again, back to it being on a continuum, we can sometimes be in the yellow zone and still be functioning. We're at a 50, right? Noticing things are different. We might be a little bit irritable from time to time. We might find that we don't want to socialize as much. Before we get into the red zone, you want to make sure that those are addressed. Where the red zone, you might find that your mental health symptoms are very, very severe and extreme. And at this point, we're talking mental illness or a diagnosis in terms of your functioning. But knowing that this can exist on a continuum,
Right.
and it's bilateral, right? Or bidirectional, I should say, where you can find yourself going back and forth. And so even if you are in the yellow or in the orange, you could still get back to the green zone again. But it's
easier to get back to the green from the yellow than it is from the red. And I think that the myth of getting mental health help is like you must be diagnosable.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the red zone to get that help. I always think of it more like physiotherapy. If you go and get physiotherapy immediately after a physical injury, you're going to be able to rehab it much faster. If you walk on a sprained, broken foot for a year of getting support.
Recovery looks much different. And so we want to take more of a preventative early intervention approach versus waiting until it's persisted and it's starting to impact our lives and impact our relationships, impact our children. Sometimes we wait until that point where, okay, it's impacted my marriage now or impacted how I relate to my kids, but it can be treated a lot earlier with great results versus waiting until we get too far into it.
I feel like a really great shift would be just the assumption that you're going to need support, as opposed to just know if you're negatively impacted by that horrific thing you just went through, and then we'll get you the support. It's like, well, then they have to admit there's a problem. Why isn't there just a general assumption this is probably going to affect you one way, shape, or form? Let's just get in there right away and not as a punishment. As it's understandable this is going to affect you. But also we know humans are never good at this, is that when there's a delay between something happening and then me feeling affected by it, because we know the beauty of denial. Exactly. We have factual denial, but we also have this emotional denial experience, which just feels like numbness, but we interpret it as, I feel okay. You know, how are you doing? I'm okay. Because it feels okay. But it's actually this emotional numbness of shock, emotional numbness of, I haven't fully processed what happened. So
I don't even know how I'm doing. I think that's it. It's giving that space and time, right? But then again, coming to a level of acceptance around, okay, this makes sense that it would impact me, but they can only do with what I share.
Right.
And I think that's something that we see a lot with CAF members or even veterans, where it's like, well, I'm not disclosing these things. Or I'm not talking about, I'm not sharing it, but I know that it's impacting me.
Yeah.
And so the system can have everything in place to support you. But if you're putting one all down your PCL scores or you're not being transparent and honest, and it's very difficult for you to get the support that you're needing. I would say to anyone who's listening is be honest with yourself and how you're feeling and how you're functioning. The same level of compassion.
Don't
minimize.
Because there can be a bit, is there a gender thing? Because I know like a lot of wives have to tell their husbands when they go to the doctor, please don't minimize these symptoms.
Here are the notes, take this with you.
This is really what's happening. Like, don't be like,
I get that all the time.
Fine. It's not.
They're like, my wife told me to give this to you. Like, all right, wow. Okay. Did not tell me about this. But that's exactly it. Where it's a culture where, again, it's just like, just power through it. You'll be fine. Just get through it. But the impact of that on everyone else around you is not always the positive one if we don't talk about what's happening. The same compassion that you would show to a subordinate or to somebody else, even to your spouse or to your children, show that to yourself. Say, go talk to somebody, get some help. Be that to yourself. The supports are in place, they're available, but if you're not open and honest with where you're at and you don't recognize the impact that it has on you, then it's hard for the supports to meet you at your point of need.
Yeah. Now, something that you got to experience is watching people go from active members to veterans. So can you give us a bit of insight on what you noticed about that transition and what that's like for people?
Yeah, I would say it's a very challenging and shocking transition in a lot of ways. Some of the folks who are in the military have been there from their very early adult days. So we're talking 17, 18, straight out of high school. And for many folks, they don't leave until they've done 25, 35 years serving. And so their reintegration to civilian life is much different than what it was when they left life as a civilian. And so there's a lot of cultural shock on their part, right? A lot of, I can't stand civilians. And so there's a lot of shift that happens with.
I imagine their like blissful ignorance is annoying. It's like you just walk around. Like, you don't need to you're putting your back to the door. What are you doing?
Are you okay? Do you know what happens in the world around you?
Right.
And so there's a lot of a shock that goes on for veterans once they enter Civvy Street and just trying to navigate that piece as well. A lot of shock to the systems. We spent some time this week talking about the healthcare system and how that's very difficult and challenging to navigate for veterans.
I never even thought, somebody was telling me about how they were born in a different province and then moved all around during their military career. And then when they came out, they were in Ontario, so they come out without an OHIP like number. It's like, oh, I never thought about that. Now they have to go through the whole process of figuring out the Ontario healthcare system, which we know is not.
Yeah, exactly. So now they all have to learn how to get, because they would have not had no HIP number too, right? So while they're in the military, and so they would now have to learn how to get a HIP number, how to get a primary care clinician as well.
Which is difficult for everyone.
All of those moments of shock, you know, when you think about even their access to care, they have it a lot quicker because funding looks different when you're in the military to get into that surgery a lot quicker than you would as a civilian. So there's a lot of differences that they notice coming out, even the structure of things, right? Even if they go into a workspace, they're like, I'm always the first one at work. And timing is something that they always adhere to differently than they would see other civilians do. There's a lot of changes.
I can see hierarchy being a challenge because let's say you go into a workforce and people are being disrespectful to the manager. They would be like, what is going on? You're a manager and someone's being disrespectful to them. I've never seen this before. This is not how it works.
So there's a lot of shock, right? Whoa, is that how things are? Is this how life is on Civvy Street? So there's definitely a lot of adapting. That's what they say on
Civvy Street?
Civvy Street, yeah. So there's a lot of adapting that has to happen for folks as they transition, and a lot of relearning. Identity is huge. Yeah. Identity is huge. That comes up a lot in the work that I do with veterans of like, okay, who am I now? And grieving the loss of who they were, even if the end of their military career was on their terms. Like, even if it was like, I retired, I served 35 years, like I did my part, you know, and there's nothing else that I can give at this point. It still becomes a moment of grief and of loss of like, okay, I knew this was going to come. I anticipated this. However, I'm still feeling the loss of who I was in service versus who I am now.
Because I feel like the role is so much more all-encompassing just because the culture is so much more all-encompassing of the entirety of who you are.
Yeah.
Because your family is affected by it with moves and all that kind of stuff, right? As opposed to like just a general career.
Exactly. It's a culture. It's not just the job. Exactly.
That's why it's really important to have all of the veteran stuff out there and resources out there.
So that they can still feel like they're a part of their culture.
Yeah.
But definitely, it's a different kind of culture. Because I think, again, if you think of any other culture, like you still keep your culture, regardless of whether your job is different, whether or not you move provinces, your culture is your culture, right? But whereas when you leave the military piece, like you're leaving behind a culture that you were a big part of. So you're
there's culture within culture there too, right? Because there's culture within culture, like the Air Force.
Exactly.
See a lot of that? Do you see a lot of like, oh, this person is in this?
Yeah.
And they have an opinion about the other whatever here.
Of course, there's always something to be said about the different elements. Right. And then there's like non-commissioned and commissioned. Right?
Oh, what's that?
So
tell me
again, like the officers. So we're talking like lieutenants and captains and majors and colonels versus like the sergeants, the warrants, the MWOs. And so there's subcultures within the culture, right? And there's definitely some cross overlap. And so again, the culture can be very nuanced and lots of moving parts to really learn and explore within that. But I think just being able to remove themselves from that piece, but then when they adapt the veteran culture, it kind of just becomes like an even playing field at that point in time.
Okay.
Right. We definitely still would hear different conversations around like, oh, what did you do? And where did you go? And all that kind of stuff. But at this point, the playing field is a lot more even compared to when you're in, the cultures are filled with more subcultures.
Did you ever notice that there would also be a sort of, I didn't have it as bad as, and therefore I shouldn't complain or be not okay or anything like that because other people have had it worse?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially when you think about PTSD. And so I see that a lot in terms of like, well, my PTSD is not as bad because I didn't get it from being blown up in Afghanistan, you know, or my PTSD is not as bad because I didn't lose a friend. Like, again, the comparing and contrasting. Very slippery slope to get into when we start to do that with our symptom.
Because all our temperaments are different, and actually how we're impacted by things varies across every human.
And at the end of the day, the PTSD criteria is the same. So if you met criteria for PTSD, it's because you had avoidance and re-experiencing and hyper.
The severity is not tied to the severity of the situation. It's more tied to what I thought about the situation at the time. So we've seen people in car accidents get horrible PTSD, even though they were unscathed from the accident because they saw their life and maybe the life of those in the car with them flash before their eyes. They thought, this is it. We are done. Then something amazing happens, luck happens, and everybody's
so the exposure
safe.
Piece
That can still cause trauma. And I think again, a lot of people are like, well, nothing happened, therefore I shouldn't be affected. It's like, no, not
That's not
how it works.
Yeah, that's not how it works.
No.
So PTSD is PTSD. And I think it's looking at the exposure, the threat, the dangers, and exposure to death. And those are all the aspects that we think about. And sometimes if you have someone who's gone through like a military sexual assault or trauma, they might tend to minimize compared to someone who's gone through combat trauma.
Right.
But it's like, guys, PTSD is PTSD.
Yeah.
You know? And so the comparing piece could be one of those barriers in terms of access to care.
Right.
It's like,
I don't deserve.
I don't want to hold up the line. That's what you often hear, right? I don't want to hold up the line when there's somebody else who, you know, had their friend blown up, right? But it's like we want to be able to move away from that because that just perpetuates the stigma around mental health, and it prevents the help that's needed from being received and being accessed. So I think that's definitely a valid piece that you see a lot is comparing symptoms, comparing traumas, comparing experiences, not in a way that's always adaptive,
right?
Not in a way that often moves us into getting supports, but more so repels us and helps us to think that we're not as deserving.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about today that we didn't touch on? I feel like we hit all the points.
I think the important thing is to realize and recognize that these experiences, there's treatment available for these supports, and there's supports that are accessible, not just for the veterans, but also the impact that it has on the spouses. And the importance of spouses as caregivers, as supporters, as individuals of your own to get support as well. Don't feel as if it's only about the member who needs to get support. When you're functioning well as a spouse, it also helps the member in terms of their mental health.
That's a huge protective, good, strong support network.
So we want to make sure that the spouses are equally supported and that they know that they have access to care and access to support. And we want to make sure the entire family system is functioning, but we know it can function with the supports available to them.
Well, thank you with your expertise with the military folks.
Yes, lots of good information and supports available. I think it's lots of things to bring to the forefront. And I'm glad that we talked about this and put it out there for folks to hear and to learn about.